These are the GHOSTGLIDE Vortex skates, one of the most unique, if not the most unique skate I've ever covered here on the channel. Despite their small size, the Vortex skates are made out of a very unique material and have a unique texturing to them that allows the Vortex skates to give you the highest degree of control you can get from a dot skate, or any skate I've tested for that matter. But just like we've seen with GHOSTGLIDE's other skates like the 66 skates I recently covered, the Vortex skates feel very niche and experimental to a degree, but unlike the 66 skates, the Vortex skates are viable and actually offer some fantastic performance. But we're going to talk all about the Vortex's unique performance profile, as well as the pros and cons about GHOSTGLIDE's most unique skate offering, and much more in today's episode of the mel0n Review. But before we get into it, I did want to say a big thank you to Potent Gaming, who was kind enough to send over the Vortex skates for review. GHOSTGLIDE's also recently released their Cyclone Mini Donut skates, which appear to be a better version of my beloved X-Ray Pad Donut skates, so I will have a review on those coming in a couple weeks, so be sure to get subscribed so you don't miss that review. But without further ado, let's get right into today's episode of the mel0n Review. In terms of pricing, each set of the Vortex skates retails for around 20 Canadian dollars, which is around $15 USD, the same price as the Cyclones and the 66 skates. In terms of versions, the Vortex skates only come in dot skate form. There are no full-size or pre-cut skates available for this skate type, as I mentioned earlier, due to their extremely high controlled performance profile. If they were any larger than dot skates, they'd be unusably slow. Just like the other GHOSTGLIDE skates I've covered, the Vortex skates come in the same envelope style packaging. Inside we have a single alcohol wipe and the same little welcome card that we saw included with GHOSTGLIDE's other skates. Also included, of course, is the Vortex skates themselves. Each set of the skates comes with 40 dot skates, the same number of skates we saw included with the Cyclones and the 66 skates. As I said when I reviewed both the Cyclones and the 66 skates, I would love to see GHOSTGLIDES use the back of the welcome card to have a more detailed installation guide here instead of this little blip on the back of the packaging, as it'd be much easier for customers to understand the process with some pictures that guide them, for example like X-Ray Pad does with their skates. The installation process for the Vortex dots is the same process used for any other dot skate. Simply remove your existing skates entirely. If you have full-size stock skates installed on your mouse, make sure you remove both layers if they happen to be a dual layered skate. Next, use the included alcohol wipe to clean the skate cutouts and remove any leftover adhesive residue from the old skates. Let that evaporate away, and then you can go ahead and install your Vortex skates. Now, in terms of how many skates to use, due to the Vortex's highly controlled nature, I'd recommend only using 4 to 6 on smaller mice and only 6 to 8 on larger mice, but this is entirely up to personal preference. Just make sure that the dots are positioned evenly and that you use the same number of dots on both the top and the bottom of your mouse. And also make sure not to use too many dot skates, as the more you use, the more diminishing returns you'll get in terms of performance, especially with the Vortex skates because of their highly controlled nature. Because of this, I'd recommend sticking between the 4 to 8 dot skate range just to ensure the performance is consistent here with these skates. In terms of dimensions, the Vortexes are sized similar to the Cyclones, but they're slightly smaller, measuring 6mm wide and 0.8 to 0.85mm thick. The starting thickness of the skates will be 0.85mm, and as the surface texturing wears down, they'll slowly wear down to be around 0.8mm thick. Now, due to their more normal sizing, the Vortex skates will be fully compatible with most, if not all, mice. But just like we saw with the 66 skates, mice with deeper skate cutouts might cause the Vortex skates to bottom out, as the skates aren't tall enough to offset the depth of deeper skate channels. From my testing, the Vortexes were much more compatible than the 66 skates were across the board in terms of mice compatibility, but they weren't as compatible as the taller Cyclone dots. But again, their compatibility will vary depending on the depth of your mouse's skate channels. Now, as I mentioned earlier, the Vortexes are made out of a very unique material. Unlike the hardened PTFE material of the Cyclones and the nylon material of the 66 skates, the Vortex skates are made out of UHWM, the same material makeup as the X-Ray Pad Obsidian Pro series skates. Now, I've talked at length about this material here before on the channel when I covered the X-Ray Pad Obsidian Pro series skates, as it has the highest durability of any skate material aside from gem and glass, and of course it's highly resistant to wear and tear like nylon is, just to a much higher degree. It's also completely hydrophobic, just like PTFE and nylon is, so the Vortex's performance will be consistent in both dry and high humidity environments. Another unique aspect to this material is that UHWM is also a very high friction material, and in combination with the skate's texturing, the skates have an extremely high friction coefficient, as I mentioned earlier, but I'll talk more about this later in this video. In terms of shaping, the Vortex skates, as I mentioned earlier, have some very unique dimensions, measuring 6mm wide and 0.8 to 0.85mm tall depending on their wear level. As such, the skates are shaped similarly to the Cyclones, having a cylindrical shaping with a concave base and a convex top, but as I mentioned earlier, unlike the smooth surfacing of the Cyclones, the Vortex skates have a rough micro-texturing across their surface. Uniquely, this texturing isn't just on the top of the skate, this texturing actually runs through the whole skate, so even when the skate's surfacing eventually wears down to the 0.8mm thickness, the skates will have the same highly texture controlled feeling as they would out of the box. In terms of mouse compatibility here for the Vortex skates, as I mentioned earlier, due to their 6mm width, they'll fit on almost every mouse, but just like the 66 skates, mice with very deep skate cutouts might cut away too much of the Vortex's height, so you might have issues with your mouse bottoming out on some mice in combination with some pads. From my testing, the Vortexes were compatible with pretty much every mouse I had in my collection, such as the Wiseowl OGM Pro V2, Cloud V2, Fantech Aria 2, Pulsar X2 series, and Sora V2, to name a few, but they weren't usable on mice like the Hitscan Hyperlight and Zhao U2 due to their deeper skate cutouts, but those mice are also incompatible with a lot of other dot skates, so this isn't exactly surprising. Now, aside from the slight compatibility issues with some mice, another area where the Vortex skates have some compatibility issues is in terms of mouse pads. Since the Vortexes are still dot skates, they'll have the same mousepad compatibility issues as every other dot skate I've covered here before on the channel. As such, the Vortex skates will be incompatible with all soft firmness pads and some but not all medium firmness pads. On hard firmness pads, the Vortexes are the best in my opinion and work perfectly on pads like the Kurosan Samurai and Focus Ambition and the Lethal Gaming Gear Saturn Pro Firm. But due to their micro-textured surface, the skates will feel very rough on rougher surface mousepads such as the Razor Strider or the Waco Island Project 87, so keep that in mind as while the Vortex skates are compatible with these pad types, they'll feel very rough compared to their usage on smoother surfaced pads. Another thing I wanted to know is that despite the Vortex's UHW and material makeup, due to their rougher textured surface, GHOSTGLIDES' advertising of these skates are not made for glass pads, as hard pads will damage the rougher surfacing of these pads extremely quickly, which will lead to a lot of performance and inconsistency issues with how they glide, so these skates are not designed for use on any hard pads. If you want a skate that's designed for hard pads, you're much better off going for the Cyclone dots, those will be much more compatible, but the Vortex skates are not designed for any kind of hard pad. I also wanted to quickly note that even though the Vortex skates have a textured surface, it's not textured in a way that will damage a pad surface. GHOSTGLIDES told me they did extensive testing for this and found that the Vortex skates with their micro texturing didn't wear on a mousepad surface any more than any other skate type on the market, so rest assured you can use the Vortex skates on any fabric pad without damaging them any faster than you would with any other skate that's available on the market. Now that we've talked about the Vortex characteristics, let's dive into their performance profile next. As I mentioned several times in this video already, the Vortexes are designed to be an extremely controlled skate. According to GHOSTGLIDES, the Vortex skates are designed for people who want a much more controlled glide, but they also state that due to their highly controlled nature, they're not going to be for everyone. They also note that the skates are designed for cloth-based pads, not hard pads as I mentioned earlier. In terms of the skates feeling, the Vortex skates feel similar to the 66 skates in having a controlled performance profile, having a higher overall friction coefficient and more initial braking and dynamic friction than standard PTFE skates, but the Vortex skates take this controlled performance profile to an extreme. As I said earlier, despite being dots, smaller ones at that, they have the highest friction coefficient I've ever tested on a skate, even higher than the TGX Plastics and Exact skates. They feel similar in theory to how the XtraPad Obsidian Pro skates, which were also made out of UHWM, felt when they were used on fabric pads, but the Vortex skates, due to their micro-textured surface, don't have that insane stickiness that the Obsidian Pros had, so unlike the Obsidian Pros, the Vortexes are usable on fabric pads. They still have an insanely high degree of initial dynamic and braking friction, but a usable amount in my opinion. As such, I'd classify the Vortex's skate performance profile as extreme control, as they feel significantly more controlled than both the 66s and the Cyclone dots did. Now before I move on, I wanted to quickly mention that the Vortex skates do have a kind of break-in or work-in period, so to speak, as due to their highly controlled nature, they do take a couple days to get accustomed to. The skates also have a slight physical work-in period, as over time the micro-textured surface will eventually wear, causing the contact area for the skate to be the skate's body, not the surface texturing, but because the texturing runs through the skate itself and it's not just on the surface of the skate, this will only slightly affect the Vortex's performance and make them ever so slightly faster, but the change in the skate's performance isn't significant enough to shift it from its extreme controlled performance profile. Now that we've talked about the Vortex's performance profile, let's talk about how they feel on different pad types. For my testing here, I used 6 of the Vortex skates on my Fantech Aria 2, and I played around 40cm per 360. In terms of speed pads like the Lethal Gaming Gear Neptune and IKEA V2, the Vortexes felt much faster than expected, but they're still very controlled, feeling similar to the amount of friction you'll feel in the XtraPad Obsidian Donut skates. On this pad type in particular, the skates felt the most balanced, and they were best suited for more static-oriented aiming, but they were usable for dynamic aiming and tracking to a degree, just with a much higher friction coefficient. On hybrid pads such as the Focus Ambition, the Vortex's controlled nature essentially eliminated any semblance of speed I could feel on the Ambition, and they felt more akin to how the 66 skates felt when used on hybrid pads, just significantly more controlled. As such, on this pad type, the skates were best suited for more static and flicking aiming. Technically speaking, they were usable for tracking or dynamic aiming, but the high degree of initial and braking friction was so high it was really hard to track targets that were AD strafing, so they are usable to an extent, but I think they're much more optimized for static and flicking performance. And lastly, on control pads like the Zowie GSR2, the Vortex's extreme control performance profile was the most emphasized on this pad type. The Vortexes ended up feeling so controlled and had such a high degree of initial and braking friction, the skates were very difficult to use. This is where that break-in time I talked about earlier comes into play, as for the first couple days I generally couldn't use these skates, but after a couple days use I got accustomed to them. But even once I got accustomed to them on controlled surfaces, these skates are only usable for static and flicking aiming. Dynamic and tracking aiming is borderline impossible on this pad type. I guess with a lower centimeter per 360 you could use it for dynamic and tracking, but at 40 cm the experience was not that great. Now before I move on, I wanted to quickly mention sense ranges. The Vortex skates are not designed for anyone running a lower sense or a higher centimeter per 360, as even at 40 cm the Vortex skates slowed my movement so much that tracking dynamic aiming suffered some significant performance losses. So keep this in mind: if you're running 40 to 50 centimeter per 360 and above, you might need to drop your centimeter per 360 to account for the extreme control given by these skates. For higher sense players in the 20 to 30 centimeter range, the skates will still significantly slow down your aim, but by a small enough margin where you don't necessarily need to compensate for it. And lastly, I wanted to quickly talk about reusability. The skates seem to be using the same adhesive that the Cyclones and 66 skates used, but since the Vortex skates aren't as flat as the 66 skates, they're much easier to dislodge from the base of your mouse. And the adhesive over my testing from moving them between mouse to mouse has held up very well, and I didn't have any issues with the skates becoming loose or not anchoring properly. But seeing as most people won't be moving the Vortex skates between as many mice as I have, I highly doubt anyone will have any issues with the skates anchoring or any issues of reusability here with the Vortex skates. Alright, well in closing, overall the Vortex skates are surprisingly my favorite skate from Ghost Glides so far. While they are very niche and very experimental in my eyes, they feel like a hybrid between the Cyclones and the 66 skates to a degree, but better than both in my opinion. Of course, they do have their shortfalls, as all dot skates do, and they're not designed for low sense aimers, but the fantastic static performance you get from the Vortex skates does justify their $20 price tag in my opinion, and despite their nicheness, I really like the Vortex skates, and in my opinion, the Vortex skates are the best skate you can get on the market right now for TAC FPS performance. But while the Vortexes are my current favorite skate from Ghost Glides, they recently released their new Cyclone Mini Donut skates, which from what I've seen look like a direct upgrade from my beloved X-Ray Pad Donut skates. So while the Vortexes hold the crown for now, we'll have to see if their Cyclone Mini Donuts can dethrone them, but we'll talk about that in a future episode of the mel0n Review. But that's going to be everything for today's episode of the mel0n Review. Thank you very much again to Potent Gaming for sending over the Vortex skates for review. I greatly appreciate it. Big thanks to our channel members, Yuki89 Prince, It Was Luck, Lunaris, Markworld, and everyone else. Our channel member support is what makes what I do here on the channel possible, so thank you very much for your ongoing support. If you'd like to become a member here and support what I'm doing here on the channel with the in-depth reviews and the Teardown project, you can become a member here for only $2 Canadian a month. Alternatively, you can also use code mel0n with a 0 over at Lethal Gaming Gear, Potent Gaming Gear, Met Keys, and TJ exclusives, as well as a couple other retailers, to save yourself some money and help directly support the channel. But that's everything for today. Thank you very much again for watching my review of the GHOSTGLIDES Vortex skates, and I'll catch you all in the next episode of the mel0n Review. Peace.